I've seen loyalty in many forms: a parent's sacrifice, a soldier's oath, even the quiet devotion of a stray dog waiting for an owner who never comes back. But I'd never seen loyalty roar down a street on two wheels. Not until Grace Morgan's world collided with a brotherhood she never imagined would claim her as one of their own. If you believe kindness has the power to echo back when you least expect it, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's proof that even in the hardest moments, the right people can ride in and change everything. The rain had a way of making the animal shelter smell like old newspapers and hope, both clinging to the damp air like ghosts. Grace Morgan didn't mind. In fact, she loved it. She loved the rhythm of the place, the click of kennel latches, the soft whimper of scared dogs that turned into wagging tails once her hands touched them, the warm weight of fur pressed against her legs when a creature finally decided to trust her. That little building at the edge of town wasn't glamorous. Its peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights could testify to that. But for Grace, it was a sanctuary as much for her as it was for the animals. She wasn't there for glory or social media likes. She wasn't chasing feel-good headlines. Grace volunteered at Ridgeway Animal Rescue because she believed someone had to show up, even when the world didn't care. And Grace always showed up, until the day she couldn't. It started like any other Saturday. Gray skies draped over the town like an old wool blanket, heavy with the promise of rain. Grace parked her beat-up sedan at the curb, juggling a tote bag full of donated blankets she'd picked up from a friend. Her breath puffed little clouds in the cold air as she hurried toward the shelter door. She was thinking about the new litter of puppies that had come in last night, their tiny cries echoing through the walls during the 2 a.m. volunteer livestream she'd stayed up watching. She didn't see the puddle until it was too late. One foot hit slick concrete, and before she could gasp, the world tilted. The bag of blankets exploded like a parachute as she fell sideways. The crack of bone meeting pavement rang in her ears like a gunshot. For a second, she couldn't breathe. The pain came fast and merciless, white-hot and blooming across her ankle until tears stung her eyes. Someone shouted her name, Amy, the new volunteer, and then voices, footsteps, hands lifting her gently. Grace tried to smile, to make a joke about her clumsiness, but the words tangled in her throat when she looked down and saw the unnatural angle of her foot. Her stomach lurched. At the hospital, the doctor's voice was matter-of-fact, as if announcing the weather: fractured tibia. You'll need a cast and crutches. Absolutely no driving for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Grace nodded like it didn't matter, like her whole life wasn't built on moving, commuting to work at the library, running errands for her elderly neighbor, volunteering at the shelter twice a week without fail. She thanked the doctor, smiled at the nurse, and even managed a half-hearted laugh when they handed her the paperwork. But inside, something fragile cracked right along with that bone. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, her leg propped awkwardly on a pillow, the sterile scent of hospital soap still clinging to her skin. Rain tapped against the window like impatient fingers. Grace stared at the wall and tried to calculate how she was supposed to make this work. There was no Uber in Ridgeway, too rural, too far from the nearest city. Public transport? A joke. Her closest friend lived 30 miles away, and asking for daily rides wasn't an option. Her parents were gone. No siblings. Just her and a handful of dogs that wouldn't understand why she'd stopped showing up. By Monday, the panic really set in. Bills didn't pause for broken bones. Her job at the library offered sympathy, not paid leave. And the shelter called twice. They were drowning in surrenders. Grace, is there any way you can come in? Even just for a few hours. Amy's voice had sounded so hopeful, so desperate. Grace promised she'd try, then hung up and stared at her crutches. Try? She couldn't even make it down the porch steps without feeling like a baby deer on ice. By Wednesday, desperation nudged her towards something she'd never done before: asking strangers for help. She opened her laptop, heart pounding harder than it should for something so small, and typed into the local Facebook community group, "Does anyone know of a ride service for volunteers? I can't drive for 6 weeks, and the shelter really needs help." She hovered over the post button for a full minute, biting her lip. Then, with a shaky exhale, she clicked and waited. 1 hour passed. Nothing. 2 hours. Just the little notification that teasing her with pity likes. By midnight, Grace shut the laptop, throat tight. She shouldn't have expected miracles. People had their own problems. Why would anyone care about a broken volunteer and a bunch of stray dogs? But the next morning, everything changed. Grace's phone buzzed at 7:13 a.m. A message from someone she didn't recognize. You take care of the strays. Let us take care of you. We ride at 8 a.m. She blinked. Read it again. We ride. Confused, she tapped the profile photo. A black leather patch with a skull and angel wings stared back at her, stitched above 3 words that sent a chill straight down her spine. Hell's Angels MC. Grace's first thought? This was a joke. Some internet prankster messing with the poor animal lady. She almost laughed, almost deleted it. But then her phone buzzed again. This time, a photo, the front of her house, taken just now. Her old blue porch swaying in the breeze. Her mailbox gleaming with morning dew. The caption read, 8 o'clock sharp. Wear something warm. Grace's breath stalled. She scrambled to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty. Just wet asphalt and a scattering of fallen leaves. But something about that message burrowed into her chest, cold and electric. Who were these people? Why did they know where she lived? And why? Why? Out of all the women in this town, had they chosen her? Grace didn't have the answers yet. All she knew was that in 47 minutes, her quiet, careful life was about to roar to life with the sound of engines. And nothing would ever be the same again. Grace had always thought the loudest thing in her neighborhood was the garbage truck on Thursdays. That was before 8 o'clock on that gray morning when the air itself began to tremble. It started as a faint murmur, low, distant, like a storm crouched just beyond the horizon. Grace sat on the edge of her couch, crutches propped awkwardly beside her, staring at the clock as if sheer willpower could make time stop. 7:58. Her phone buzzed again. Step outside when you hear us. Her pulse thudded in her ears as the sound grew louder, rolling through the quiet street like an approaching army. And then, there they were. 7 motorcycles turned the corner in perfect formation, their chrome bodies gleaming wet from the drizzle, exhaust rumbling like some ancient beast awakening. Leather vests caught the weak sunlight, black and scarlet patches bold against the gray morning. And on every back, one name stitched in sharp white thread, Hell's Angels. Grace froze by the window, breath locked tight in her chest. They didn't belong here, not on this sleepy little road lined with maple trees and bird feeders. Neighbors peeked through blinds like nervous cats, phones raised to capture shaky videos for gossip later. Grace could practically hear the whisper that would spread across Ridgeway before noon. What on earth is Grace Morgan doing with bikers? Her hands trembled as she gripped the crutch handles and pushed herself up. The floor creaked under her weight as she limped to the door, every step echoing louder than the engines outside. She told herself she could still back out, still pretend this never happened. But when she opened the door and saw them lined up at the curb like steel horses, her doubts scattered like startled pigeons. The leader was the first to remove his helmet, a tall man with a braided gray beard and eyes the color of gunmetal. His leather vest bore a name stitched in bold white, Reverend. He swung one leg over his bike with an ease that said this wasn't just transportation. This was his skin. Grace Morgan, he asked, his voice a low rumble that carried even over the idling engines. She nodded, gripping the doorframe for balance. Her throat felt dry. That's me. He smiled, just a small curve of the mouth, but enough to soften the hard edges of his face. We hear you've got a problem. We don't let people who care fall through the cracks. Grace blinked. Words tangled somewhere between her brain and her lips. We? Before she could ask, Reverend reached behind him and held something up. A helmet, sleek, shiny, and unmistakably new. Pink. Grace stared. You brought a helmet? Figure you'll need it, he said. You're riding with us. Her stomach swooped like she'd missed a step on a staircase. I what? No, I can't. Look, I appreciate the offer, but I don't even. Grace, Reverend said, stepping closer, his boots heavy on the wet pavement. You get on that bike, or you stay home wishing you had. Your choice. She wanted to laugh, to slam the door and pretend this was some fever dream. But then she looked at the helmet again, at the reflection of her own pale face in its glossy surface, and something inside her shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion from fighting battles alone. Maybe it was the way the engines hummed like a living promise. Or maybe, just maybe, It was the spark of curiosity burning through her fear. She swallowed hard. "Okay," she whispered. "Just give me a second." 5 minutes later, Grace stood at the edge of her porch, crutches dangling uselessly from one arm, her injured legs stiff inside the thick cast. Reverend approached without a word, his big hands steady as he helped her settle onto the wide leather seat behind him. The bike felt alive beneath her, every vibration rolling up through her bones like thunder. "Hang on tight," Reverend said. She didn't need telling twice. Her arms wrapped around his torso, fingers clutching the worn leather of his vest. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as the engine roared louder, joined by the others in a synchronized growl that made the street tremble. And then, they moved. The convoy rolled down the block, tires slicing through puddles, engines bellowing like distant drums. Wind whipped Grace's hair as houses blurred into streaks of gray and green. For a few wild, breathless seconds, she forgot everything. Her broken ankle, her mounting bills, the ache of feeling invisible. The world narrowed to speed and sound and the steady, unshakable presence of the man steering them forward. They didn't take the main road. Instead, they veered onto a winding back route lined with towering pines that dripped rain like tears. Grace clung tighter as the bikes leaned into curves, the smell of wet earth and gasoline mixing in the cold air. She expected fear. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to freedom. By the time they roared into the shelter's gravel lot, Grace's cheeks were flushed pink from the wind. The other volunteers froze mid-step as 7 black and chrome machines rolled in like a cavalry from some outlaw legend. Dogs barked wildly from their kennels, tails thumping against chain-link fences as if even they sensed the shift in the air. Reverend cut the engine and turned to Grace. "You good?" Grace slid off with his help, her crutches waiting in the hands of a biker with tattoos like map lines on his arms. She nodded, breathless. Yeah, I'm good." Good was an understatement. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Inside, the shelter buzzed with whispers. Amy's eyes went wide as saucers when Grace hobbled in trailed by a wall of leather and chrome. "Grace," she whispered. Who are they?" Grace opened her mouth, then shut it. How could she explain? That they'd come because she asked for a ride, and now they stood here like an unspoken promise of something bigger? Reverend answered for her. "We're friends," he said simply. Then he scanned the cramped, overworked space, his gaze lingering on the cracked floors, the rusting cages, the stack of unpaid bills by the computer. His jaw tightened. "Looks like you could use more than a ride." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll see." And in that moment, Grace realized something. She hadn't just accepted a ride. She'd opened the door to a storm she couldn't stop. The question was, did she even want to? If Grace thought that first ride was the end of the surprise, she was wrong. It wasn't the end. It was the spark, and sparks, when caught by the right wind, have a way of turning into wildfires. The Hells Angels didn't just drop her off that day. They stayed. All of them. Boots planted on the cracked concrete like sentinels while the shelter's staff looked on, jaws slack with disbelief. One biker, Tank, with arms thick as tree trunks, hauled 40-pound bags of dog food from Grace's car like they weighed nothing. Another, a woman named Hawk, crouched by the kennels, scratching behind the ears of a trembling mutt until its tail wagged like a metronome set to hope. At first, the other volunteers didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't a town that welcomed surprises, especially surprises wrapped in leather and roaring chrome. But when the bikers started fixing things, patching broken fencing, hauling out busted crates, scrubbing grime off walls, the hesitation melted like frost under morning sun. These weren't strangers bringing trouble. They were an army of quiet efficiency, and for the first time in months, the shelter didn't feel like it was drowning. Grace moved through the chaos on her crutches, her heart swelling until it ached. She tried to thank them, stammering words that felt too small for what they were doing, but Reverend just gave her that steady look of his, as if gratitude wasn't necessary, as if this wasn't kindness, it was duty. By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, the shelter looked almost new. Cages repaired, food organized, the floor scrubbed until it gleamed. Even the dogs seemed to sense the shift, barking less, wagging more, their anxious pacing replaced with the soft sigh of contentment. Grace leaned against the doorway, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but she couldn't stop smiling. She hadn't smiled like this in weeks, maybe months. And as she watched Reverend toss a wrench back into his saddlebag, the question that had been simmering since morning finally bubbled out. Why? Her voice was small against the hum of voices and the faint squeak of a mop. Reverend turned, one brow raised. Grace swallowed hard. Why are you doing this? For me. For a long beat, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, boots clicking against the tile, and stopped just inches away. His voice was low when he spoke, measured, almost gentle. Because you showed up, he said simply. Even when nobody asked you to. Even when nobody thanked you. You kept showing up for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves. People like that. His gaze held hers, steady as an oath. They don't ride alone. Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled in the knots swelling inside her chest. So she just nodded, blinking fast, hoping the tears didn't spill. They didn't just ride away and disappear. No, the angels came back the next day. And the day after that. Sometimes 2 bikes, sometimes 10. At first, they came for the shelter, building new runs, donating food, even setting up an adoption event in the Walmart parking lot that drew half the county. But soon, it became something more. Grace started to know their names, their stories. Tank, who could deadlift an engine block, but wept like a child when an old hound laid its gray muzzle in his lap. Hawk, a former EMT who stitched up a terrier's paw with hands steady as glass. Chains, who once spent a year behind bars, but now raised money for veterans' families like his own life depended on it. They were rough, yes, weathered, carved by mistakes and roads most people wouldn't survive. But under the leather and ink beat hearts so fierce and loyal it stole Grace's breath. And slowly, the gossip changed. Whispers turned into wide-eyed wonder as townsfolk saw what was happening. The shelter got a new roof, paid in cash. The vet bills, once stacked like a tower of doom, vanished after a fundraiser ride that stretched for 30 miles and drew bikers from 3 states. By winter, Ridgeway Animal Rescue wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. And Grace? Grace wasn't just the girl who broke her ankle anymore. She was family. The day her cast came off, Reverend showed up at her door. Alone this time. His braided beard glinted silver in the afternoon light, and in his hands he held something that made Grace's breath catch. A helmet. Pink, just like before. But this one had her name on it. Lettered in white across the back, bold and unmissable. Beneath it, a single phrase, AFFA. Always forever, forever always, the Brotherhood's creed. Grace stared, speechless. Reverend, don't thank me, he said, his gravel voice softening into something that sounded almost like a smile. Just ride. Didn't take the main highway. Reverend led her down the back roads, where sunlight spilled like molten gold across endless fields. The wind tangled her hair, kissed her cheeks, carried away every shadow of doubt that had ever chained her. For the first time in her life, Grace wasn't just going somewhere. She was flying. When they crested a hill, she saw it. Rows of bikes lined up along a dusty clearing, chrome flashing like mirrors under the setting sun. Engines rumbled in greeting as the angels turned to watch her approach. And then she saw what they'd built. A brand new kennel. Bigger than anything the shelter had dreamed of. Fresh lumber. Gleaming runs. A roof that would never leak. On the front gate, a sign carved into steel. Morgan's Haven. Grace slid off the bike, her knees trembling as Reverend helped her stand. She stared at the sign until her vision blurred, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. You didn't have to. Reverend cut her off with a shake of his head. No, he said simply. But family takes care of its own. And right there, surrounded by the rumble of engines and the smell of rain on steel, Grace understood something she'd never forget. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's leather and chrome. Sometimes it roars down your street when you think the world has left you behind. She lifted the helmet, slipped it on, and when Reverend asked, "You ready?" she didn't hesitate. "Oh," Grace said, her voice breaking into a grin that felt like sunlight. "Hell yes." The convoy thundered to life, engines roaring in unison, a promise, a vow, a song of loyalty that would echo across every road they traveled together. And as the horizon swallowed them whole, Grace thought of the girl she'd been. Lonely, limping, afraid, and whispered into the wind. Not anymore.